Alara never imagined that one day she would sit face to face with one of the most feared predators in the wild. A kind of encounter that would turn an ordinary afternoon into something extraordinary. Something no one would believe unless they had witnessed it themselves. Out in the vast Kalewood wilderness, where silence reigned and the nearest neighbor was miles away, danger lurked in unexpected forms. For years, Alara had watched from her porch as nature moved in its quiet rhythm. She had seen deer grazing at dawn, heard the distant howls of wolves in the dead of night, and once even spotted a mountain lion slipping through the trees. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment when a grizzly bear emerged from the shadows and locked eyes with her, an old woman bound to a wheelchair with nowhere to run. Alara had always found solace in solitude. At 82 years old, she had long outlived most of her family and friends. After her husband's passing years ago, she made the bold decision to leave behind the bustling city life and retreat to the wilderness of Kalewood. She wanted peace, a place where time slowed down, where the only sounds were the rustling of trees and the songs of distant birds. Her cabin stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless pine trees and towering mountains. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and with no neighbors in sight, the wilderness became her home. Most people her age wouldn't have dared to live alone in such isolation, but Alara had never been one to fear solitude. She saw it as a gift. However, there was one thing she couldn't change: the wheelchair that had become part of her life years ago. A severe nerve condition had taken away her ability to walk. Doctors told her she would rely on the chair for the rest of her days, but Alara was never one to dwell on what she couldn't do. Instead, she adapted. Her cabin was small but efficient, designed to allow her to move freely despite her condition. She had a generator to power essential appliances, a fireplace that kept the place warm during brutal winters, and enough food stored in her pantry to last for months. Every 2 weeks, her only visitor, a kind-hearted man named Torin, would drive up the dirt road to bring supplies and check on her. Though her body had grown weaker with time, her mind remained sharp. She spent her days reading books, tending to her small garden, and observing the wildlife that passed through her land. She enjoyed watching deer graze in the meadow and squirrels scurry up the trees. On rare occasions, she spotted wolves in the distance, their silver eyes glinting in the twilight. Despite the remoteness of her home, she never felt unsafe. She had learned how to coexist with nature, understanding its rhythms and respecting its dangers. She knew how to store food properly to keep bears away and kept a shotgun near the door, though she had never fired it. For years, nothing had disrupted the quiet routine of her life. She believed she had seen all that nature had to offer, but she was wrong. One particular afternoon, as she sat in her wheelchair on the porch watching the sun cast golden hues over the trees, something changed. The birds that usually chirped from the treetops suddenly went silent. The usual rustling of leaves in the wind ceased. A stillness settled over the forest, the kind that sent a shiver down Alara's spine. Then, out of the dense woods, stepping into the clearing, came a massive figure. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was looking at. A grizzly bear. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. Towering, powerful, and impossibly close, and it was walking straight toward her. Alara's heart pounded in her chest. She had seen bears before, always from a safe distance, always fleeting glimpses as they moved through the wilderness. But this was different. This grizzly wasn't just passing through. It was coming straight toward her. Her fingers gripped the arms of her wheelchair as an instinctive wave of fear surged through her body. She had read enough about grizzlies to know they were unpredictable. A single swipe of its massive paw could end her life in an instant. Running was impossible. Even if she could walk, there was nowhere to go. The bear's deep brown fur shimmered in the fading sunlight, muscles rippling beneath its thick coat as it moved with slow, deliberate steps. It was enormous, easily over 800 pounds, its towering frame dwarfing Alara's frail body. Its dark eyes were locked onto her, studying her with a gaze that sent chills through her spine. She had no food on her, no way to distract it, no weapon within reach. Her shotgun was inside the cabin, just a few feet away, but it might as well have been miles beyond her grasp. Bears were usually drawn by scent, and she wondered what could have brought this one so close to her home. Had it smelled the bread she had baked that morning? Or was it just curious? The bear took another step forward, and Alara felt her breath hitch. Her mind raced through every survival tip she had ever learned. Avoid sudden movements, stay quiet, do not make eye contact. But how could she not stare when a creature this massive was approaching her with such purpose? She felt the wooden porch beneath her wheelchair, the only thing separating her from the ground. If the bear decided to climb up, there was nothing stopping it. Alara thought about calling for help, but she knew it was pointless. Torin wouldn't be coming until tomorrow. Even if she screamed, no one would hear her out here in the heart of the wilderness. She was utterly alone. The bear was only 10 feet away now. Her hands trembled. Every instinct told her to flee, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped, frozen in place as the beast loomed closer. Then, without warning, the bear stopped. Its heavy breathing filled the silence, its chest rising and falling in deep, measured movements. It sniffed the air, its massive head swaying slightly as if trying to understand what she was. Alara didn't dare move. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The bear simply stood there, watching her. Then it took another step. Alara's heart pounded so hard she thought it might give out. The bear was now close enough that she could see the details in its fur, the scars on its snout, the sharp curve of its claws. This was it. This was the moment where everything could change. She braced herself, waiting for the inevitable. But what happened next was something she never could have expected. Alara's breathing became shallow, her chest rising and falling with the weight of pure terror. The grizzly was now only a few feet away, close enough that she could hear its slow, heavy breaths, see the flicker of its nostrils as it took in her scent. Her body refused to move. Even if she had the strength to push her wheelchair back, she was stuck. One of the wheels had nudged against the uneven wooden boards of the porch, locking her in place. She was completely vulnerable. The bear shifted slightly, lowering its head. Its powerful shoulders rolled forward as it took another step. Alara's fingers dug into the arms of her chair. Every muscle in her body tensed in anticipation of what was coming next. This was it. She had read stories, horrifying accounts of grizzlies attacking humans in the wild. It happened in an instant. A single swipe, a bite to the neck, a force so powerful it would crush bones with ease. Her mind screamed at her to do something. But what? She had no gun, no way to defend herself. A single thought echoed in her mind. This is how I die. Her eyes darted toward the cabin door. The shotgun was inside, leaning against the wall near her chair. If she could just reach it, if she could somehow move fast enough, but the bear was too close. There was no chance. Her throat tightened as she tried to swallow the fear pressing against her chest. The silence was unbearable. She felt the weight of the bear's presence pressing down on her, its sheer size making her feel as small as a child. Then something strange happened. The bear let out a deep, guttural sound. Not a growl, not a roar, but something softer, a low, rumbling exhale, almost like a sigh. Alara's breath caught. The bear wasn't snarling, wasn't showing its teeth, wasn't displaying the aggressive behavior she had feared. Instead, it simply stood there, watching her, studying her. Alara's pulse hammered in her ears as she tried to process what was happening. Why wasn't it attacking? Why hadn't it lunged? She stole a glance at its body. That was when she noticed something she hadn't before. The bear was thin. Its ribs weren't fully visible, but there was a gauntness to its frame, a hollow in its muscles. For an animal of its size, it looked weaker than it should. Alara had spent enough years in the wilderness to recognize hunger when she saw it. This bear wasn't here to attack. It was here because it was starving. Her mind raced with possibilities. Could it have been struggling to find food? Were prey becoming scarce, driving it to wander farther than usual in search of something to eat? A new kind of fear crept into her chest. Not fear of being mauled, but fear of what hunger could drive a wild animal to do. A starving bear was unpredictable, could lash out in desperation, attack not because it wanted to, but because survival left it no other choice. Alara didn't know what to do. Every part of her screamed to stay still, to not make a move that could be perceived as a threat. But at the same time, she couldn't just sit there and wait for the bear to decide its next action. Her fingers trembled as she reached down toward the small basket on the side of her wheelchair. It was a habit of hers, keeping a few pieces of food nearby when she sat outside, mostly to nibble on while she read or enjoyed the fresh air. There was a half-eaten loaf of bread inside, nothing substantial, but it was something. Alara's fingers closed around it, her heart hammering. She knew this was dangerous. Feeding a wild bear was never a good idea. It encouraged them to come back, to seek humans as a food source. But what choice did she have? If she didn't do something, the bear might grow desperate. Slowly, so slowly it felt like time had stopped, Alara lifted the small piece of bread and tossed it toward the bear. The world seemed to hold its breath. The bread landed softly on the ground. The bear flinched slightly but didn't back away. Its eyes flicked downward, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. For a moment it didn't move. Then, carefully, deliberately, it lowered its massive head, opened its jaws, and picked up the small piece of bread. Alara didn't dare breathe. The bear chewed slowly, almost thoughtfully. Then, after a long pause, it lifted its head and looked at her again. There was something different in its gaze now, something Alara never expected to see. A flicker of understanding. She felt her pulse slow just a little, though fear still clung to her bones. The grizzly had accepted the bread. But what did that mean? Was it satisfied with just a morsel, or had she made a terrible mistake by offering food? Her mind was clouded with uncertainty, yet she couldn't deny what she had just witnessed. This wild beast, capable of unimaginable power, had taken the food with the gentleness of a creature far different from the one she had feared moments ago. The bear chewed slowly, its massive jaws working through the soft bread. Its dark eyes never left Alara, as if it were still studying her, trying to make sense of what she was. She had heard stories of bears raiding campsites, breaking into homes, and attacking people in the wild. But this was something she had never imagined possible. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the crisp scent of pine. The bear lifted its head slightly, its nostrils flaring again as it took in the air. Alara remained perfectly still, gripping the sides of her wheelchair as she tried to keep her breathing steady. The bear's presence was still overwhelming, a looming force that could change in an instant. Then something even more shocking happened. The bear let out a soft rumbling noise, a deep, throaty sound that Alara could only describe as peaceful. It wasn't a growl, wasn't a warning. It was something else entirely, almost as if the bear was content. Alara's fingers trembled as she reached into the basket again, pulling out another small piece of bread. Her heart pounded as she hesitated. But then, slowly, she extended her hand outward and tossed the piece toward the ground once more. The bear's ears twitched, its gaze following the motion. For a moment it hesitated. Then, just as carefully as before, it lowered its head and took the second offering. Alara couldn't believe what she was seeing. A wild grizzly, one of nature's most fearsome creatures, was sitting just feet away from her, eating from her hand like a stray dog in search of kindness. The air felt thick with something unspoken, something beyond words or logic. There was an understanding here, a silent agreement between two living beings who had found themselves in an impossible moment. Alara knew she should still be afraid. Any sudden movement could shift the delicate balance between them. But for the first time since the bear had appeared, she felt something else creeping in. She had lived in these woods for years, but never had she been this close to a creature so wild, so untamed. And yet, looking into the bear's eyes, she saw something unexpected. Hunger, yes, but also something deeper, something almost lost. The bear licked its massive lips, finishing the last of the bread. It blinked slowly, lowering itself onto its haunches as if settling in, as if deciding that, for now, this spot right next to Alara was where it wanted to be. Alara had no idea what to do. The bear was comfortable, unthreatened, but it was still a bear. Should she try to move? Should she attempt to scare it away? She didn't know what the right decision was. All she knew was that she was sitting just feet away from an animal that could kill her in an instant. Yet, for some reason, it hadn't. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The bear's breathing was slow, steady. Alara forced herself to take a deep breath as well, calming the tremor in her hands. The longer she sat there, the more the initial terror began to fade. She studied the bear's body more closely. It wasn't just hungry, it was weak. The more she looked, the more she noticed the signs. The way its fur clung too tightly to its frame, the way its movements, while still powerful, lacked the full strength of a well-fed grizzly. This wasn't a bear in its prime. This was an animal struggling to survive. Alara's heart clenched at the thought. She had always respected nature, understood its brutal cycles of life and death. But seeing this creature up close, seeing the way it sat there, not as a predator but as something searching, something desperate, it struck something deep inside her. The bear let out another low rumble, shifting its weight as it settled further into the ground. Alara watched as its powerful body relaxed, its muscles no longer coiled with tension. It was as if it had made a decision, one that defied every natural instinct it should have had. Instead of attacking, instead of retreating, the bear stayed. Alara exhaled, finally allowing herself to release the breath she had been holding for far too long. This was not how she expected this day to go. And yet, as she sat there beside a grizzly, the impossible unfolding before her, she realized something. She was not afraid anymore. Whatever had brought this bear to her doorstep, whatever hunger, desperation, or curiosity had led it here, it had chosen not to harm her. And in return, she had chosen not to fear it. A connection had formed between them, fragile yet undeniable. And as the last rays of sunlight faded behind the mountains, Alara knew this was a moment she would never forget. Alara sat motionless, her breath steady but mind racing. The bear, still so close, showed no signs of aggression, no indication that it saw her as prey. Instead, it seemed at ease. Its powerful frame had settled beside her wheelchair, its massive paws resting in the dirt as if it had no intention of leaving just yet. She had always thought of bears as creatures of instinct, driven by hunger, survival, and dominance, but this one was different. There was something behind its dark eyes, something that made Alara feel as though the animal was more than just a wild predator. The bear let out another deep, rumbling exhale, a sound so low and resonant that Alara felt it in her chest. She couldn't tell if it was exhaustion, relief, or something else entirely. It wasn't growling, it wasn't snarling. It was simply there, existing beside her. Alara dared not move too much, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear now. She studied the animal up close, something she never imagined she would be able to do. Its fur was thick but slightly matted, the edges of its coat rough and unkempt. A few scars ran along its shoulder and side, signs of battles long past. But what caught her attention most was the hollow in its body. It was large, yes, but leaner than it should have been. This bear had been struggling. Alara thought of the past few weeks, how she had noticed fewer deer wandering through her property, how the usual sounds of smaller animals rustling through the brush had started to fade. Maybe food had become scarce. Maybe this bear had wandered far beyond its usual territory in search of something to keep it alive. And somehow, against all odds, it had ended up here. The thought made something tighten in her chest. She had lived alone for so many years, convinced that she could handle whatever came her way. But this creature, as wild and powerful as it was, seemed to be fighting a battle of its own. Alara watched as the bear shifted slightly, its eyes drooping for just a moment. It was tired, not just physically, but in a way that Alara understood too well. The exhaustion of carrying on when the world had given you every reason to stop. Her fingers twitched at the side of her chair. She knew it was dangerous, knew that what she was thinking of doing went against every survival instinct she should have had. But she did it anyway. Slowly, carefully, she reached into the small basket she kept beside her chair. Her movements were cautious, deliberate, making sure not to startle the creature that sat beside her. She pulled out the last bit of bread she had and held it in her lap, hesitating for just a moment. Would it understand? Would it see this as an offering or a threat? The bear sniffed the air. Alara extended her trembling hand slightly, not close enough to touch, but close enough for the bear to see what she was offering. The bear's eyes flickered between her face and the food. Seconds passed. Then, with a careful slowness that seemed almost unnatural for a creature of its size, the bear leaned forward. Alara's heart pounded as she felt its hot breath against her fingers. It took the food, not with a snap of its jaws, not with desperation, but with a quiet, measured precision. For the second time that day, Alara found herself staring in disbelief. She had fed a wild grizzly. The bear chewed in silence, its massive head inches from her frail body. Alara should have been terrified, but instead, all she felt was awe. The two of them sat together in an unspoken truce, neither one understanding exactly why the other had chosen not to run. Alara knew she should be careful. This bear would eventually need to move on. It could not rely on humans. But something deep inside her told her that this was not just about food. This bear had chosen to stay. Alara's gaze softened as she watched the creature's movements. There was a sadness in its posture, something beyond hunger or exhaustion. It reminded her of the loneliness she had felt so many nights, sitting on this very porch, staring out into the vast wilderness and wondering if she had made the right choice in living so far from the world. She had lost her husband, had lost friends, had lost the kind of companionship that made life feel whole. And now, in the most unexpected of ways, she was sitting beside something just as lost as she was. The bear finished eating and lifted its head once more, licking its lips. Alara could almost see the faintest hint of relaxation in its muscles. Then, as if it had found what it was looking for, the bear let out one final deep breath and slowly, carefully, lowered itself onto the ground beside her. It did not leave. It did not retreat into the woods. It simply lay there, next to an elderly woman in a wheelchair, in a silence that felt heavier than words. Alara exhaled, her body finally relaxing. Whatever had brought this bear to her, whatever force had led it to her doorstep on this day, it was not here to harm her. It was simply here. And for the first time in a long time, Alara did not feel alone. Alara sat there, barely daring to move, as the massive bear settled onto the ground beside her. She had spent years in the wilderness, surrounded by the untamed beauty of nature, but never had she felt so close to it, so deeply connected to something wild and unpredictable. The bear let out a long, slow exhale, its body rising and falling with each steady breath. Alara found herself mirroring its rhythm, letting her own breathing slow to match its calm. The fear that had gripped her earlier had not completely vanished, but something else had taken its place. Curiosity, fascination, maybe even a strange kind of trust. The last of the day's sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden streaks across the clearing. The air was cool, crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Alara had always loved this time of day. The quiet, the stillness, but she had never imagined she would be sharing it with a grizzly bear. She glanced down at her hands, noticing how steady they were now. Just an hour ago, she had been frozen in terror, convinced that her life was about to end. And yet here she was, alive, untouched, and sitting beside one of the most fearsome creatures in the wild. The bear shifted slightly, its fur brushing against the ground as it adjusted its position. Alara noticed now how truly exhausted it looked. The hunger had weakened it, but it was more than that. It carried itself like something that had been wandering for too long, something that had lost its way. She knew that feeling all too well. Alara had chosen this life of solitude after her husband died, believing that she was better off alone. The pain of losing him had been unbearable, and she had convinced herself that isolation was easier than facing the emptiness of the world without him. But in the quiet moments, when the wind howled through the trees and the night stretched endlessly, she had felt the weight of loneliness pressing against her chest. And now, looking at the bear beside her, she wondered if perhaps it understood that feeling too. The bear made a low rumbling sound, almost like a hum, as it rested its head on the dirt. It wasn't asleep, but it had let its guard down completely. Alara took that as a sign of trust. She hesitated before reaching down toward the small table beside her, where she kept a metal cup of water. Every movement was slow, deliberate, careful not to startle her visitor. She lifted the cup slightly and tilted it, letting a small stream of water drip onto the ground in front of the bear. The bear's ears twitched. Its dark eyes flicked toward the water. For a moment it did nothing. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, it extended its massive tongue and lapped at the damp earth, absorbing the moisture. Alara held her breath. She had just shared water with a grizzly bear. The weight of the moment settled over her, heavy and surreal. She had no explanation for why this bear had come to her, why it had chosen to sit beside her instead of attacking, why it had accepted her food and her presence without resistance. But she did know one thing. She was no longer afraid. Alara let her gaze drift toward the horizon, where the last sliver of sunlight was disappearing behind the trees. The sky was darkening, shifting to deep blues and purples, the first stars beginning to emerge. She knew the bear wouldn't stay forever. This was its home, the wild. It didn't belong beside an old woman in a wheelchair. But for now, just for this moment, they were here together. A human and a grizzly, two lonely souls who had found each other in the middle of the wilderness. And in the silence between them, there was an understanding. No words, no explanations, just the quiet acceptance of two beings who, against all odds, had chosen peace instead of fear. Alara let out a slow breath, allowing the weight of everything to settle. Tonight, she was not alone. And for the first time in a long time, she was grateful for that. As the last remnants of daylight disappeared beyond the mountains, Alara remained still, unwilling to break the delicate moment she had found herself in. The bear had not moved much, its breathing slow and steady as it remained by her side. The night air had grown colder, the temperature dropping with the fading sun, but Alara barely noticed. The warmth of the bear's presence, the sheer enormity of what had just happened, was enough to keep her frozen in wonder. Then, in the distance, a sound broke the silence. The low hum of an approaching vehicle. Alara's ears perked up, her mind snapping back to reality. Torin, her neighbor, came every few weeks to check in on her, bringing supplies and making sure she had everything she needed. She had almost forgotten that today was one of those days. As the sound of the truck's engine rumbled closer, the bear lifted its head. It turned its massive body slightly, its ears twitching, sensing the approaching presence. For the first time since their strange, silent bond had formed, Alara felt a flicker of concern. Would the bear react aggressively to another human? Would it feel threatened? Would Torin panic at the sight and do something reckless? The headlights of the truck cut through the trees, bouncing over the uneven dirt path as it neared her cabin. Alara could see the silhouette of Torin behind the wheel, completely unaware of the situation he was about to drive into. Then, as if sensing the shift, the bear exhaled deeply. It pushed itself up, its powerful limbs stretching as it slowly rose to its full height. Alara watched, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and sadness. The moment was ending. Torin's truck came to a slow stop a few yards away, the headlights washing over the porch, illuminating Alara and the giant creature beside her. Everything seemed to slow. The driver's door opened, and Torin stepped out. The instant his boots hit the ground, he froze. Alara could only imagine what he was seeing. An old woman in a wheelchair, sitting motionless with a fully grown grizzly bear standing just feet away. Torin's breath hitched, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt, where she knew he kept a weapon. "Don't!" Alara's voice finally broke through the thick silence. Torin's wide eyes flicked to her. The bear turned its head slightly, locking eyes with the man standing beside the truck. There was no aggression in its stance, no sudden movements, just a silent acknowledgement of his presence. For a brief second, no one moved. Then the bear exhaled one last time, shifting its weight before turning toward the trees. Alara watched as it walked away, its massive body disappearing into the shadows of the forest. It didn't run. It didn't look back. It simply left. Torin stood there, still frozen, his face pale and full of disbelief. "What?" he started, but words failed him. Alara let out a long breath, finally feeling the tension leave her body. "I don't know," she admitted, shaking her head. "But it didn't hurt me." Torin stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he took a cautious step forward. "Are you okay?" Alara nodded. "I am." She wasn't just okay. She was changed. Something inside her had shifted. She had spent years fearing the world. Fearing loss. Fearing the pain that came with being alone. But tonight, in the most unexpected way, she had been reminded of something she had long forgotten. Fear wasn't always the answer. Sometimes, even the wildest of creatures could show kindness. And sometimes, when you least expected it, the universe had a way of reminding you that you weren't as alone as you thought. The silence lingered long after the bear had disappeared into the woods. Alara sat in her wheelchair, staring at the darkened tree line, still feeling the presence of the massive creature even though it was gone. Her hands rested lightly on the arms of her chair, her body finally releasing the tension it had held for what felt like hours. "Alara?" Torin breathed, running a hand through his hair. "That was a grizzly. A real, full-grown grizzly." "I know," she said softly. "And it was just sitting there with you." Alara nodded, her gaze still locked on the place where the bear had vanished. "It wasn't here to hurt me." Torin exhaled sharply, as if trying to process what he had just seen. "That doesn't make sense. Bears don't do that. They don't just sit with people." Alara finally turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't think this one was like the others." Torin crouched down beside her, his concerned eyes scanning her face. "Are you sure you're all right?" "I'm fine," she assured him. And she was more than she had been in a long time. The encounter had left her shaken, but not in fear. It had awakened something deep inside her. Something she hadn't realized she had been missing. Connection. For so many years, Alara had lived in this cabin, tucked away from the world, believing that solitude was the only way she could cope with the loss of her husband. She had convinced herself that being alone was better, that she didn't need anyone. But tonight had proven otherwise. The next morning, Alara found herself drawn to the porch earlier than usual. She scanned the tree line, half expecting, half hoping to see the bear again. But there was nothing, just the soft golden light of dawn stretching across the clearing. Torin, still shaken by what had happened, installed a camera on her porch later that afternoon. "Just in case," he said. "If that thing ever comes back, we'll have proof." Alara only smiled. She didn't need proof. She knew what had happened. She had lived it. Days passed, and every now and then, she caught glimpses of movement in the trees. A shadow shifting through the underbrush, the distant crack of branches snapping. She knew the bear was still out there. One evening, she left a small piece of food at the edge of the clearing. Not too close, just enough to let the bear know she remembered. The next morning, it was gone. Alara never saw the bear up close again, but she felt its presence. And somehow, knowing it was out there made the vast wilderness seem a little less empty. As the seasons changed and the first hints of winter settled over the land, Alara sat on her porch, wrapped in a thick blanket, watching the world around her. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel lonely. She had learned something she would carry with her for the rest of her days. Fear and survival had their place in the wild, but so did trust, so did understanding. And sometimes, even the most unbelievable moments could remind you that you were never truly alone.